We all know what it feels like to be forgotten, to stand at the edge of hope with nothing left to offer. Sometimes life brings us to our knees, and we wonder if anyone will see our worth when the world has turned away. In the frozen market square of Skarnvik, a young woman named Runa faced that very moment. Cast out by her family and starving, she knelt in the mud, begging for bread and offering her life in return. The crowd laughed at her desperation, but Stigvar the Red, the most feared Viking warrior in the north, stepped forward. He knelt beside her and spoke words that changed everything. "I take no life for food, but I will take a wife who knows honor, even in hunger." What made this legendary raider see something in a starving outcast that no one else could see? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence that followed Stigvar's words hung in the air like the morning mist over the fjord. Runa's fingers clutched at the frayed edges of her torn cloak. Once fine wool dyed the color of autumn leaves, now reduced to threadbare patches that barely kept the northern wind from her bones. The cloak had belonged to her mother, passed down through 3 generations of women who had known prosperity. Now it served as the only reminder of a life that seemed like a distant dream. The market square of Skarnvik sprawled before them, a testament to the harsh realities of 9th century Norse life. Stone buildings hunched against the perpetual wind, their timber roofs weighted with sod that grew green in summer, but now lay dormant under a thin layer of frost. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, carrying the scents of dried fish, burning peat, and the metallic tang of the smithy's forge. The air itself seemed to bite at exposed skin, turning breath into visible clouds that dissipated quickly in the relentless cold. Merchants had arranged their wares on wooden planks balanced across barrels, displaying salted herring, blocks of aged cheese, and loaves of dark bread that steamed in the morning air. The bread, dense with barley and rye, represented sustenance that Runa had not tasted in 3 days. Her stomach cramped at the sight, a hollow ache that had become her constant companion since her uncle had cast her from his household. "Get up, child." Stigvar's voice rumbled like distant thunder, but his tone carried an unexpected gentleness. His massive hand extended toward her, weathered and scarred from decades of wielding sword and shield. Each finger bore the marks of countless battles, a pale line across his knuckles where an opponent's blade had found its mark, calluses thick as leather from gripping weapon hilts. Runa hesitated, her green eyes searching his face for signs of mockery or cruel intent. She had learned to read such signs in the weeks since her world had crumbled. Stigvar's features were carved from granite and wind, high cheekbones, a jaw that spoke of determination, and eyes the color of winter seas. His red hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was bound in intricate braids that marked him as a man of status. The torque around his neck, twisted gold worked with intricate knotwork, declared his wealth as surely as his reputation preceded him. "I said, get up," he repeated, his hand still extended. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Old Bjorn, the fish seller, leaned on his walking stick, his rheumy eyes wide with amazement. "Stigvar the Red takes no wife," he muttered to his neighbor. 20 years of raiding, 20 years of refusing every match offered by jarls and kings. "Perhaps the Maiden has bewitched him," whispered Astrid the Weaver, her fingers unconsciously tracing protective runes in the air. "Cast out by her own kin, there must be a reason." But Ingrid, the baker's wife, whose hands were white with flour, shook her head slowly. Look at her eyes. No witchcraft there, only hunger and pride. Pride enough to starve before stealing, pride enough to offer her life for bread. Runa slowly placed her trembling hand in Stigvar's massive palm. The warmth of his skin sent a shock through her cold, numbed fingers, and she felt the strength in his grip as he helped her to her feet. Standing, she barely reached his shoulder. though she carried herself with the bearing of one born to better circumstances. Her dark hair, once elaborately braided in the style of noble houses, now hung in simple plaits that framed a face made gaunt by hardship, but still holding traces of the beauty that had once made her the prize of her father's household. "Your name," Stigvar said, though it was more statement than question. "Runa, daughter of Eriksson the Bold," she replied, lifting her chin despite the shame that burned in her chest, though I no longer claim that name. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Eriksson the Bold had been a respected warrior, a man of honor who had died fighting sea raiders 3 summers past. His death had left his household vulnerable, and his brother, Runa's uncle, had inherited both lands and debts that proved too burdensome. "You claim it now," Stigvar declared, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Runa Eriksdottir, will you stand as my wife before the gods in this gathering?" The question struck her like a physical blow. Marriage meant survival, protection, a place by the hearth when winter winds howled. But it also meant obligation, submission to a man she knew only by reputation. Stigvar the Red was legend among the northern clans, a warrior who had sailed with the great Ragnar, who had walked through shield walls like other men walked through grain fields, who commanded a loyalty so fierce that grown warriors would die at his word. "Why?" The word escaped her lips before wisdom could stop it. "Why would you claim a woman with nothing to offer?" Stigvar's weathered face shifted, and for a moment something softer appeared in his eyes. "Because you knelt with honor in a place where others would have stolen. Because you offered your life rather than your virtue. Because—" He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "Because I have seen too much of what men call strength and too little of what the gods call courage." The answer settled over the square like the blessing of ancient spirits. Even the skeptics in the crowd seemed to nod with understanding. In their harsh world, where survival often meant compromise, Runa's desperate offer had shown a nobility that wealth could not purchase. "I accept," she whispered, the words carrying across the sudden hush. Stigvar reached into his belt pouch and withdrew a silver arm ring, its surface etched with ravens in flight. Without ceremony, he placed it on her wrist. Not the traditional finger ring that bound other wives, but a warrior's gift that spoke of partnership rather than possession. The metal was warm from his body heat, and its weight felt substantial against her thin wrist. "Witnesses!" Stigvar called out, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. "Let it be known that Runa Eriksdottir stands as my wife from this day, bound by silver and sworn before you all." The crowd erupted into discussion. Some voices raised in approval, others in shock, many in the kind of gossip that would spread through every hall and household before the sun reached its peak. But Runa heard only the sound of her own heartbeat, suddenly loud in her ears. Stigvar turned to the baker, whose stall held the bread that had drawn Runa's desperate bargain. "What price for your finest loaf?" "For you, Lord Stigvar, no price at all," the baker stammered, extending a warm loaf wrapped in clean linen. "I pay my debts," Stigvar replied firmly, placing a silver coin on the wooden counter, payment enough for a week's bread. He handed the loaf to Runa, and she felt tears threaten at the simple kindness of the gesture. "Come," he said, offering his arm. "My hall awaits." As they walked through the parting crowd, Runa clutched her torn cloak closer, but for the first time in weeks, the cold seemed less biting. The cobblestones beneath her worn shoes led toward a future she could not have imagined when the sun had risen that morning. Behind them, the market square buzzed with the kind of story that would be told around fires for years to come, how Stigvar the Red claimed a bride not from among jarls' daughters or wealthy merchants' children, but from the mud and desperation of Skarnvik's marketplace. The path to Stigvar's hall wound upward through the town's winding streets, past workshops where smiths hammered metal and carpenters shaped wood, past homes where smoke curled from chimneys and women tended gardens that would soon face winter's full fury. With each step, Runa felt the weight of her new circumstances settling around her like a cloak, heavier than her torn woolen garment, but infinitely warmer. At the hall's entrance, carved wooden pillars rose like ancient trees, their surfaces decorated with intricate scenes of wolves, ravens, and warriors locked in eternal combat. The great doors stood open, revealing a warmth that beckoned like promise itself. As they crossed the threshold together, Runa understood that her old life had ended as completely as if she had truly offered it in that marketplace. What began now would be written in the strength of the man beside her and whatever courage she could summon in the days to come. 3 days after their unexpected wedding, Runa stood at the carved window of Stigvar's hall, watching the harbor through the morning mist. The wooden shutters bore the mark of master craftsmen, intricate scenes of ships sailing beneath protective ravens. Her fingers traced the familiar pattern while her mind struggled to accept the reality of her new life. The great hall behind her bustled with activity as Stigvar's household prepared for the day. Servants moved with practiced efficiency, tending the central fire that never died, arranging tables for the morning meal, and maintaining the weapons that lined the walls in gleaming display. The warmth of the hall seemed almost decadent after weeks of sleeping in the cold, but Runa had not yet learned to take such comfort for granted. "You rise early, wife," Stigvar's voice carried across the hall, deep and measured. He emerged from the sleeping alcove where they had maintained a careful distance these past nights. She taking the bed, he sleeping on furs by the fire, both understanding the delicate nature of their arrangement. "Old habits," Runa replied, turning from the window. "My father always said dawn brought the clearest thinking." Stigvar nodded, securing his sword belt around his waist. The blade at his side was not ceremonial. Its worn leather grip and practical steel spoke of countless battles. The harbor watch reported ships on the horizon, 3 vessels flying Jarl Olaf's banner. The name sent a chill through Runa that had nothing to do with the morning air. Jarl Olaf the Cruel ruled the neighboring settlement of Grimhold, a man whose reputation for brutality extended far beyond his own lands. Her father had spoken of him with disgust, calling him a wolf who preyed on weakness and honored no code save his own ambition. "Why would he come here?" Runa asked, though the tightness in her stomach suggested she already knew. "Trade disputes, most likely," Stigvar replied, but his hand rested unconsciously on his sword hilt. "Olaf believes the best part of any bargain comes at spear point." A commotion from the harbor drew their attention. Through the window, Runa could see 3 long ships cutting through the morning waters, their dragon prows carved in the likeness of serpents with jeweled eyes that caught the early light. The ships moved with purpose rather than the casual pace of trading vessels, their oars rising and falling in perfect rhythm. "How many men?" Runa asked, counting the oar ports along each vessel's side. 60 warriors, perhaps 70, Stigvar estimated. Enough to make demands, not enough to take Skarnvik by force. He paused, studying her face with those winter sea eyes. "Why do you ask such questions?" Most wives would concern themselves with household matters. "My father taught me to read the signs of trouble," Runa replied simply. "He said a leader's wife must understand warfare as well as weaving." Something shifted in Stigvar's expression. Approval, perhaps, or recognition. "Your father was wise. Come then, if you would learn more." They descended from the hall to the harbor, where a crowd had gathered to watch the approaching ships. The vessels had reached the wooden docks, and men were securing mooring lines while others unloaded shields and weapons. The warriors who emerged bore the hard looks of professional fighters, scarred, alert, and confident in their strength. Jarl Olaf himself stood among them like a wolf among hunting hounds. He was a man of middle years, his beard shot through with gray, but his body still carried the muscle and scars of active warfare. His clothes spoke of wealth accumulated through violence, fine furs, gold armbands, and a sword hilt wrapped in silver wire. When his eyes found Stigvar across the harbor, his smile held no warmth. "Stigvar the Red," Olaf called out, his voice carrying easily across the water. "I hear congratulations are in order. Marriage to a foundling, how romantic." The insult landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of tension through the gathered crowd. Runa felt the burn of shame rise in her cheeks, but Stigvar's hand found hers, his grip steady and reassuring. "Jarl Olaf," Stigvar replied, his tone neutral but carrying undertones of steel. "Your ships bear many warriors for a peaceful visit." "Peaceful?" Olaf laughed, the sound harsh as a raven's call. "When has anything between us ever been peaceful?" He gestured to his men, who began forming into a loose semicircle behind him. "I come to discuss old grievances and new opportunities." "Speak your business," Stigvar said, moving slightly to place himself between Olaf and Runa. "The shipping lanes," Olaf declared, loud enough for all to hear. "Your merchants have been using waters that belong to Grimhold. My patience grows thin with such trespass." It was an old claim and a weak one. The sea routes between Skarnvik and the southern trading posts had been used freely for generations, acknowledged by custom and treaty. But Runa could see the calculation in Olaf's eyes. Not justice, but opportunity. "The waters belong to no man," Stigvar replied. "Custom and law support free passage." "Custom changes," Olaf said, his hand now resting on his sword hilt. "As does law. I offer terms, half of all trade profits, from the southern routes, paid to Grimhold as passage fee. In return, your merchants sail under my protection." The demand was outrageous, a naked attempt at extortion, but Runa could see the trap being set. Refuse, and Olaf would claim justification for raiding Skarnvik's merchant vessels. Accept, and Stigvar would appear weak before his own people and every rival who watched from afar. "And if I refuse?" Stigvar asked. "Then we discover how well your merchants swim," Olaf replied, his smile showing teeth like a predator's. "The waters can be dangerous for those who lack proper protection." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Around the harbor, Skarnvik's warriors had begun to gather, their hands moving instinctively to weapon hilts. The morning's peaceful atmosphere had transformed into something taut and dangerous. Runa felt the weight of her silver arm ring against her wrist, the ravens etched into its surface, seeming to whisper of battles yet to come. In the space of a few minutes, her new life had acquired complications she had not foreseen. This was not merely about trade routes or tribute. It was about power, about testing Stigvar's resolve, about whether a legendary warrior had grown soft in his settled years. "I need time to consider your proposal," Stigvar said finally. "Of course," Olaf replied with mock graciousness. "These are weighty matters. I will enjoy Skarnvik's hospitality while you deliberate. 3 days should be sufficient for such consideration." As Olaf's warriors began dispersing into the town, ostensibly as guests, but clearly as an occupying presence, Runa understood that her marriage had drawn her into conflicts far larger than personal survival. The man beside her was not just her unexpected husband, but a leader whose every decision affected hundreds of lives, and she, willing or not, had become part of that burden. The inciting incident had arrived not as a single moment of crisis, but as a creeping awareness that the peaceful interlude of their first days together had been merely the calm before a storm that would test everything she thought she knew about strength, loyalty, and the true cost of honor. That evening, Stigvar's hall filled with the low murmur of urgent counsel. The great hearth cast dancing shadows across weathered faces as warriors, merchants, and elders gathered around the carved oak table that had witnessed decades of such deliberations. At its center lay Stigvar's war hammer, not the ceremonial weapon displayed on the wall, but the practical tool of battle, its iron head marked with the scars of countless conflicts. Runa sat beside her husband, acutely aware that her presence at this council was unprecedented. Wives typically withdrew when matters of war arose, but Stigvar had requested she remain. "You asked wise questions this morning," he had told her quietly. "Perhaps you will think of others." Eric the shipmaster spoke first, his voice gravelly from years of shouting orders over ocean winds. "Olaf's demands would cripple our trade. Half our profits? We might as well hand him our coin purses and beg for scraps." "The southern routes are our lifeblood," added Magnus the silver-tongued, whose merchant ventures had made him wealthy beyond most jarls. "Without free passage, we lose everything we've built. Our children will inherit poverty." Old Gunnar, scarred veteran of 100 raids, slammed his fist on the table. "Then we fight. Olaf brings 70 men. We can muster twice that number. Why do we debate what steel should decide?" "Because," Stigvar replied calmly, "victory in battle means little if we lose everything else in the process. Dead warriors don't trade, burned ships don't carry cargo, and widows don't prosper." The wisdom in his words was evident, but Runa could see the frustration it caused among the younger warriors. They had grown to manhood hearing tales of Stigvar the Red's legendary battles, and now their hero counseled caution. "What do you propose?" asked Thorbjorn the Wise, the oldest of Stigvar's advisors. His white beard reached nearly to his belt, and his presence commanded respect even from the most hot-headed warriors. Stigvar's fingers drummed against the hammer's handle. "Negotiation. There must be something Olaf wants more than our tribute." "Land," Runa said quietly, the word slipping out before she could consider its wisdom. All eyes turned to her, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. But Stigvar nodded encouragingly, so she continued. "Olaf's holding at Grimhold is rich in warriors, but poor in fertile ground. His people raid because they cannot farm enough to feed themselves. What he truly wants is not our gold, but our prosperity." "You speak sense," Thorbjorn said approvingly. "But we cannot simply gift him our fields." "No," Runa agreed, "but perhaps we can offer something else. Marriage alliances, trade partnerships that benefit both settlements, shared hunting grounds for the winter months." Magnus leaned forward, interest sparking in his merchant's eyes. "A partnership rather than tribute. It has possibilities." "It has risks," Gunnar countered. "Trust Olaf with our trade routes, and he'll strangle them at the first opportunity." The debate continued past midnight, voices rising and falling like the tide outside. Gradually, a plan emerged, not perfect, but better than either submission or immediate warfare. They would offer Olaf a counter-propsal, shared access to certain fishing grounds in exchange for guaranteed safe passage, marriage bonds between prominent families to secure the alliance, and joint ventures that would benefit both settlements. As the council dispersed, Stigvar remained seated, staring into the dying flames. Runa waited beside him, sensing his troubled thoughts. "You spoke well tonight," he said finally. "Your father taught you more than I realized. He taught me to think before I spoke, though I fear I'm still learning that lesson." A slight smile touched Stigvar's lips. "In council, bold words are often better than safe ones. But tomorrow—" He turned to face her fully. "Tomorrow will test more than words. You're worried the plan won't work." "I'm worried about what happens when it doesn't," Stigvar admitted. "Olaf didn't come here expecting reasonable discussion. He came expecting either submission or the excuse to take by force what we won't give freely." Runa studied her husband's profile in the firelight, seeing beyond the legendary warrior to the man beneath. The weight of leadership sat heavy on his shoulders, and she realized that her own concerns about their marriage paled beside the hundreds of lives that depended on his decisions. "What would you have me do?" she asked. "Tomorrow you'll meet with the women of Olaf's party," Stigvar replied. "Diplomatic courtesy requires it. But listen more than you speak. Women often see truths that men miss." The next morning brought grey skies and a bitter wind that seemed to promise winter's early arrival. Runa dressed carefully in her finest remaining gown, a deep blue wool that had survived her family's disgrace, and bound her hair in the elaborate style befitting a jarl's wife. The silver arm ring gleamed against the dark fabric, marking her status. The meeting took place in the hall's side chamber, where tapestries depicting ancient heroes kept out the worst of the cold. Olaf's women were fewer than his warriors, his wife Thyra, 2 daughters, and the wives of his chief lieutenants. They carried themselves with the confidence of those accustomed to taking what they wanted. Thyra was a handsome woman of middle years, her blonde hair streaked with silver and her blue eyes sharp with intelligence. She examined Runa with unconcealed curiosity. "So you're the foundling who caught Stigvar's eye." "I confess surprise. I expected someone more substantial." The insult was delicately delivered but unmistakable. Runa met it with the dignity her father had taught her. "I am honored by my husband's confidence." "Confidence," Thyra repeated, tasting the word. "An interesting choice. Tell me, child, what do you know of the burdens that come with such confidence?" The conversation that followed danced around dangerous topics like warriors circling before combat. Through careful questions and cautious answers, Runa began to understand the true scope of Olaf's ambitions. This was not merely about trade routes. It was about testing Stigvar's resolve before launching larger campaigns against other settlements. "My husband believes in building alliances," Runa ventured carefully. "Noble," Thyra replied with a smile that held no warmth. "My husband believes in taking what he needs. Time will tell which philosophy proves more practical." As the morning wore on, Runa felt the weight of knowledge settling upon her like a heavy cloak. The counter-propsal they had crafted so carefully the night before would likely be rejected. Olaf had come to Skarnvik not as a negotiator but as a conqueror, testing his prey's defenses. When the women finally departed, Runa remained in the chamber, staring at the war hammer that had been moved there for the coming negotiation. Its scarred surface seemed to whisper of battles past and future, of choices that would soon demand not words, but steel. The formal negotiation began at midday, with both parties seated across the great table under the watchful eyes of carved ravens. Stigvar had arranged the meeting with careful attention to protocol. Olaf sat in the place of honor traditionally reserved for visiting jarls, while his chief warriors flanked him in positions of respect. The display suggested confidence rather than desperation. At the table's center lay a drinking horn carved from ancient ivory, its surface etched with scenes of gods and heroes locked in eternal conflict. The horn had belonged to Stigvar's father, and his father before him, passed down through generations of leaders who had faced their own moments of crisis. Today, it would serve as witness to words that might determine the fate of both settlements. "I have considered your proposal," Stigvar began, his voice carrying the measured tone of formal diplomacy. "In the spirit of kinship between our peoples, I offer terms that honor both our needs." Olaf leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the table's edge. His casual posture belied the intensity of his gaze. "Speak your terms, Stigvar, though I confess curiosity about what you imagine I need." "Prosperity for your people," Stigvar replied without hesitation. "Your warriors are skilled, your ships are swift, but Grimhold's soil grows thin. What good are gold rings on starving arms?" A flash of anger crossed Olaf's features before he controlled it. The assessment was accurate and therefore stinging. "Continue." "I propose alliance, not tribute," Stigvar said, gesturing to Eric the shipmaster, who unrolled a map of the surrounding waters. "Shared fishing rights in the northern banks, where the cod run thick in winter months. Joint trading expeditions to the southern kingdoms, with profits divided according to ships and men contributed. Marriage bonds between our houses to seal the agreement." The proposal was generous, perhaps too generous. Runa watched Olaf's expression carefully, seeing calculation rather than gratitude in his weathered features. His warriors shifted behind him, hands resting casually near weapon hilts. Interesting, Olaf mused, studying the map. And what guarantee do I have that these partnerships will endure? Alliances break like ice in spring thaw. The guarantee of mutual benefit, Thorbjorn interjected, his white beard catching the light from the hearth. When both sides profit, neither has cause to break faith. Mutual benefit, Olaf repeated, then laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the hall's wooden walls. You mistake me for a merchant, old man. I am a warrior. I take what I need and hold it with steel. The pretense of diplomacy began to crack like ice under strain. Runa felt tension gathering in the hall like the pressure before a thunderstorm. Around the table, hands moved imperceptibly closer to weapons. Then what would satisfy a warrior? Stigvar asked, his tone still level but carrying an undercurrent of warning. Submission, Olaf replied bluntly, acknowledgement that Grimhold's strength exceeds Skarnvik's. Your merchant vessels fly my banners and pay my tribute. Your harbor serves my ships as needed. Your people accept that their prosperity exists at my sufferance. The demands were even worse than expected, not mere tribute, but complete subservience. Runa saw the effect on Stigvar's men. Eric's face had gone red with suppressed anger, Magnus's merchant smile had vanished entirely, and young Gunnar's hand now rested openly on his sword hilt. You ask me to surrender my people's freedom, Stigvar said quietly. I ask you to accept reality, Olaf countered. Look around you, Stigvar. When did you last raid? When did you last take by force what lesser men would not give freely? You've grown soft, content with your comfortable hall and profitable trades. The wolf has become a house dog. The insult was calculated and precise. In their culture, few things were more damaging than accusations of lost courage. Runa felt the temperature in the hall drop as if winter itself had entered. Perhaps, Stigvar replied, his voice dangerously calm, you mistake wisdom for weakness. Do I? Olaf stood slowly, his warriors rising with him. Then prove your wisdom, house dog. Accept my terms or discover what strength still means. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Runa could feel the violence gathering like storm clouds, ready to break at the slightest provocation. Her mind raced, seeking some path between capitulation and bloodshed. A test of strength, she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. If we must speak of proof, let it be worthy of both sides' honor. Both Jarls turned to her in surprise. She had violated protocol by speaking uninvited, but the words had already been said. What manner of test? Olaf asked, his curiosity apparently genuine. Single combat, Runa replied, drawing on half-remembered tales of ancient customs. Champion against champion. The winner's demands are accepted, but the loser retains honor and his people's freedom. Runa, Stigvar warned quietly, but she pressed on. Unless, she added, meeting Olaf's gaze directly, the great Jarl fears trusting his cause to one man's strength. The challenge was expertly delivered, impossible to refuse without losing face. Olaf's eyes glittered with something between admiration and anger. You have fire in you, foundling. Very well, single combat to settle the matter. Who stands as your champion? Stigvar asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. I stand for myself, Olaf replied. Age has not yet stolen my edge. The pronouncement sent another ripple of tension through the hall. Olaf was no mere politician. He remained a formidable warrior despite his years, but Stigvar nodded acceptance. Tomorrow at dawn, Stigvar said, the beach below the harbor, with all to witness. As the formal challenge was accepted, Runa felt both relief and terror. She had bought them time and avoided immediate bloodshed, but at what cost? Tomorrow would see either her husband's victory or their complete defeat. That evening, as Olaf's party withdrew to their ships and Stigvar's advisors debated weapons and tactics, Runa found herself alone with the ancient drinking horn. Its carved heroes seemed to mock her with their eternal struggles, reminding her that some conflicts could not be resolved with clever words or desperate gambles. The die was cast, and tomorrow would bring either salvation or destruction. The night before the combat, Runa could not sleep. She lay in the great bed listening to Stigvar's steady breathing beside her, marveling at his ability to find rest on the eve of mortal combat. Outside, the wind howled around the hall's eaves like restless spirits, and she found herself thinking of her father's stories about warriors who faced their final battles. Near midnight, she rose carefully and padded barefoot to the window. The harbor lay shrouded in darkness, but she could make out the shapes of Olaf's ships, their dragon prows gleaming faintly in the starlight. Somewhere aboard those vessels, Olaf too might be lying awake, preparing for the morning's trial. Second thoughts. Stigvar's voice came soft from behind her. She turned to find him sitting up in bed, his eyes reflecting the dying embers of the hearth. About the challenge? No, about my right to suggest it. Many. You're right. Stigvar swung his legs over the bed's edge and joined her at the window. You are my wife, bound to my fate as surely as I'm bound to yours. If anyone had the right to speak, it was you. I may have doomed us both, or saved us from certain war, Stigvar countered. Olaf came here seeking any excuse for violence. At least now the violence has honor. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the dark waters. Finally, Runa asked the question that had been haunting her thoughts. Can you defeat him? Stigvar considered before answering. In my prime, without question. Today, he flexed his sword hand, studying the scars that marked decades of combat. I am not the man who earned the name Red. Time takes its toll on all warriors. Then why accept the challenge? Because sometimes a leader must risk everything to preserve what matters most. He turned to face her fully. Your suggestion was brilliant, Runa. It gave us the only honorable path forward. She wanted to feel reassured by his words, but doubt gnawed at her thoughts like a hungry wolf. In suggesting single combat, she had gambled not only with their lives, but with the freedom of every soul in Skarnvik. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. There's something you should know, Stigvar said quietly. If tomorrow goes badly, if I fall, you must be prepared. Prepared for what? To survive. Olaf is not without honor in his way. He will not harm you directly, but neither will he protect you. Your best hope would be to flee. Eric has a ship ready at the eastern dock, provisioned for a long voyage. He has orders to see you safely away. The revelation struck her like a blow. While she had been worrying about the combat's outcome, Stigvar had been planning for her survival. I won't abandon these people. You may have no choice, Stigvar replied grimly. A wise woman adapts to circumstances she cannot change. And what of a wise woman's duty to stand by her husband? For a moment, something raw and vulnerable flickered across Stigvar's features. Your husband's greatest wish is that you live to see another sunrise, regardless of what tomorrow brings. Before she could respond, a commotion from the harbor drew their attention. Torches were moving along the docks, and raised voices carried across the water. Both of them tensed, hands moving instinctively toward weapons that were not there. What do you see? Stigvar asked, his eyes not as sharp in darkness as they once had been. Runa pressed closer to the window, straining to make out details in the flickering torchlight. Men on the docks, yours and his, I think. No weapons drawn, but... She paused as a new sound reached them. Singing. They dressed quickly and made their way to the harbor, where they found an unexpected scene. Warriors from both sides had gathered around several small fires, sharing ale and trading stories. The formal hostility of the day had given way to something more primal, the brotherhood of fighters preparing for battle. Eric the shipmaster approached them, slightly unsteady from drink. Lord Stigvar, the men grow restless. Someone suggested tales of old battles and... He gestured helplessly at the mixed gathering. And warriors will be warriors. Stigvar finished, though he seemed more amused than concerned. Let them drink. Tomorrow's work requires clear heads, but tonight they may find what comfort they can. Among the gathered men, Runa spotted Olaf himself, seated beside one of the fires with a horn of ale in his massive hands. He was telling some tale that had his listeners, both his own warriors and Stigvar's, laughing loudly. For a moment, she could see the man he might have been in different circumstances, a leader who inspired loyalty through strength and humor rather than fear. "He's not what I expected," she admitted to Stigvar. "Few men are," he replied. "Olaf is brutal when he needs to be, but he's not mindlessly cruel. In another time, we might have been allies rather than enemies." "What changed?" "Desperation," Stigvar said simply. "Hungry men do things that fed men would never consider. Olaf's people face starvation if he cannot secure new resources. That makes him dangerous in ways that simple greed never could." As if sensing their observation, Olaf looked up from his storytelling. For a long moment, the two jarls regarded each other across the firelit space. Then Olaf raised his drinking horn in salute, an acknowledgement of worthy opposition rather than hatred. Stigvar returned the gesture, and Runa understood that she was witnessing something profound. These men might kill each other at dawn, but they maintained respect for the roles they played in their harsh world. "Come," Stigvar said, taking her arm. "Morning will arrive soon enough." As they walked back toward the hall, passing through groups of warriors who called out good-natured greetings, Runa felt the strange duality of their situation. Around them, men prepared for violence with the casual familiarity of those who had lived with death all their lives. Yet beneath the surface, camaraderie lay currents of tension that would explode into lethal force with the rising sun. At the hall's entrance, she paused to look back at the harbor fires. Somewhere in those flickering lights lay the key to understanding her new world, a place where honor and brutality intertwined like lovers, where friendship could exist even between mortal enemies, and where tomorrow's necessities overshadowed tonight's preferences. Inside the hall, warmth awaited, but also the approaching dawn that would test everything she had learned about strength, courage, and the true cost of survival. Dawn crept over Skarnvik like a grey wolf, silent and inevitable. Runa woke to find Stigvar already gone from their bed, though the furs still held his warmth. Through the window, she could see him on the training ground behind the hall, moving through sword forms with the methodical precision of ritual. She dressed in silence, choosing the blue gown she had worn to meet Thyra. Not for vanity, but because it carried her father's colors. If this day brought disaster, she would face it as Eric's dottir. The silver arm ring caught the pale morning light as she secured her cloak, its ravens seeming to watch her with ancient eyes. In the hall's main chamber, she found a simple meal waiting, bread, cheese, and ale, the traditional fare before battle. Thorbjorn sat at the great table, his weathered hands wrapped around a drinking cup, his eyes distant with memory or prayer. "He fights well for his age," the old advisor said without preamble, knowing her thoughts. "I've seen him train these past days. The strength is still there, though perhaps not the speed of youth." "You've fought beside him long enough to know," Runa replied, taking a seat across from him. 30 years, Thorbjorn confirmed. Since he was barely old enough to lift a shield. He was never the largest warrior or the fastest, but he possessed something rarer, the ability to think while others merely reacted. Through the window, they could see people gathering along the path to the harbor. Word had spread throughout the settlement, and every soul who could walk would witness the combat. Such events became legend, spoken of for generations regardless of their outcome. "There's something else," Thorbjorn continued, lowering his voice. "Last night after the drinking ended, Olaf sought private words with Eric the shipmaster. A chill ran down Runa's spine. What manner of words? Eric wouldn't say, but he seemed troubled afterward. Whatever was discussed, it wasn't about ships or trade. Before Runa could respond, Stigvar entered the hall, fully armed and bearing the unmistakable presence of a warrior prepared for death. His mail shirt, polished to gleaming perfection, bore the intricate patterns that marked it as heirloom work. At his side hung the sword that had earned him fame, its simple cross-guard and leather-wrapped grip giving no hint of the legendary battles it had seen. Most striking was his shield, oak boards bound with iron, painted with his personal device. A red wolf's head surrounded by runes of protection. The shield bore scars from countless combats, each mark a story of survival against impossible odds. "The time has come," he announced, his voice carrying the calm certainty that had steadied his warriors through decades of conflict. As they walked toward the harbor, the entire settlement fell into step behind them. Children ran ahead to claim the best viewing spots, while their elders followed with the measured pace of those who understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The procession reminded Runa uncomfortably of a funeral march. The chosen battleground lay on the wide beach below the harbor, where the tide had left smooth sand unmarked by footprints. At one end, Olaf's warriors had arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, their shields and spears forming a backdrop of steel and leather. At the other end, Stigvar's people gathered with similar solemnity. Between the two groups, the combatants would fight alone. Olaf was already on the beach, stripped to tunic and trousers, his own mail gleaming in the pale sunlight. His shield bore the device of a black raven, its wings spread wide as if preparing to carry the fallen to Valhalla. His sword, longer than Stigvar's and bearing elaborate silver inlay, spoke of wealth accumulated through conquest. The two men approached each other with formal ceremony, stopping at spear's length apart. An ancient ritual demanded words before violence, acknowledgement of what was about to occur. "Stigvar Grimson," Olaf declared, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I call upon you to honor the challenge given and accept it. Let the gods judge between us." "Olaf Ravensson," Stigvar replied with equal formality. "I stand ready to defend my people's freedom. May the worthier man prevail." They saluted each other with raised swords, a gesture of respect that seemed oddly gentle before such brutal purpose. Then both men stepped back, shields raised, and the preliminaries ended. For several heartbeats, they circled each other like wolves testing for weakness. Olaf moved with surprising grace for his size, his footing sure on the sandy ground. Stigvar held his guard high, protecting his head and shoulders while keeping his sword ready to strike or parry. The first exchange came suddenly, Olaf's thrust toward Stigvar's ribs, met by a ringing parry that sent both blades sliding apart in showers of sparks. Both men recovered instantly, circling again, each having taken the other's measure. Runa found herself holding her breath, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails bit into her palms. Around her, the crowd watched in absolute silence, every soul understanding that they witnessed history being written in steel and blood. The second exchange was more prolonged, Olaf pressing forward with a series of powerful cuts. Stigvar giving ground, but never breaking his defense. The younger man's strength was evident, but so was the elder's experience. Where Olaf struck with raw power, Stigvar responded with perfect technique, turning aside blows that might have shattered lesser defenses. A grunt from Olaf marked the first success. Stigvar's counter-strike had found the gap between mail and shoulder, drawing first blood. The wound was shallow, but it proved that the older warrior's edge had not entirely dulled. The sight of his own blood seemed to ignite something primal in Olaf. His next attack came with berserker fury, raining blows against Stigvar's shield with such force that the crack of wood on iron echoed like thunder across the beach. Under that relentless assault, even legendary skill began to show strain. Stigvar's breathing grew labored, his movements a fraction slower than they had been. Time, the unconquerable enemy of all warriors, began to tip the balance against him, yet still he fought on, drawing upon reserves of strength and will that had sustained him through 3 decades of impossible battles. The contest was far from over, but its eventual outcome grew increasingly clear to those who understood the mathematics of combat. The duel had been raging for nearly an hour when the first signs of Stigvar's age became undeniable. His shield arm trembled slightly under Olaf's relentless assault, and his footwork, once flawless, began to show small hesitations. Sweat darkened his mail despite the morning chill, and his breathing had grown harsh and labored. Olaf, though bloodied from several successful strikes, pressed his advantage with the calculated patience of an experienced fighter. He had ceased his berserker fury and now fought with methodical precision, wearing down his opponent like water grinding stone. Each exchange left Stigvar a fraction slower, a degree more vulnerable. Runa watched in growing despair as the inevitable approached. Around her, Stigvar's people maintained stoic silence, but she could see the defeat beginning to settle in their eyes. Even loyal Eric had stopped shouting encouragement, his weather-beaten face grim with acceptance. Then came the moment that changed everything. Olaf's sword, striking down at Stigvar's weakened shield, caught on the iron rim and twisted in his grip. For a heartbeat, barely the space of an indrawn breath, his defense opened. Stigvar, drawing on reserves that should have been exhausted, drove his blade forward in a thrust that would have ended the combat. But as the sword point neared Olaf's chest, the younger man's free hand shot out, grasping something at his belt. The morning sunlight caught the glint of steel as a hidden dagger appeared, its point driving toward Stigvar's unprotected ribs. "Treachery!" The cry erupted from a dozen throats simultaneously, but even as the words rang out, they were drowned by a louder, more shocking sound, Olaf's own voice, roaring in fury. "No!" he bellowed, striking down his own warrior's arm with his shield rim. The dagger went spinning across the sand as its wielder, a lean man with the scarred hands of a veteran fighter, stumbled backward in shock. The combat froze as if trapped in ice. Stigvar, his sword still extended in what should have been a killing thrust, stared in bewilderment at the man who had just saved his life. Olaf stood breathing heavily, his face dark with rage as he turned toward his own warrior. "Bjorn Ironhand." Olaf's voice carried absolute authority and barely controlled violence. "Did I give you leave to interfere?" The scarred warrior, apparently Bjorn, straightened defiantly. "Lord, he was about to win honorably." Olaf cut him off, as was his right by combat's law and the god's judgment. The Jarl's eyes swept across his gathered warriors, and several stepped back from the fury they saw there. "Who among you shares this cur's dishonor?" Silence answered him, but Runa could see the truth in several faces. This had been planned, a conspiracy among Olaf's subordinates to ensure victory regardless of honor. The revelation struck her like a physical blow, but not for the reasons she expected. Throughout the negotiations and even into the combat, she had seen Olaf as the clear villain, a brutal raider seeking to dominate through strength alone. But now, faced with treachery from his own men, he had chosen honor over victory. The complexity of the situation overwhelmed her previous simple understanding. "Lord Olaf," Stigvar spoke for the first time since the interruption, lowering his sword but not sheathing it. "I thank you for preserving the combat's honor." "Thank me by finishing what we started," Olaf replied, raising his own blade again. "This changes nothing between us." But it changed everything for Runa. As the two warriors resumed their circular stalking, she found her mind racing not with fear for Stigvar's life, but with possibilities she had never considered. Olaf's intervention had revealed something crucial. He was not the mindless brute she had assumed, but a leader struggling with the same impossible choices that plagued Stigvar. The combat resumed with renewed intensity, both men seeming to draw fresh strength from the interruption. But now Runa watched with different eyes, seeing not just the clash of enemies, but something more complex, a test between two honorable men forced into conflict by circumstances neither had chosen. As the fighting continued, she noticed other details that had escaped her before. Among Olaf's warriors, she could see division. Some faces showed approval of their leader's defense of honor, while others bore sullen resentment. The conspiracy that had just been exposed was not universal, but it was significant. More importantly, it suggested that Olaf himself might not be entirely committed to the path of conquest. His willingness to preserve honorable combat, even at the cost of certain victory, hinted at a man who still valued principles over pragmatism. The revelation crystallized into action as she watched the two exhausted warriors continue their deadly dance. Both men were nearing the end of their strength, and soon one would fall. But what if there was another way? "Hold!" she called out, her voice carrying across the beach with surprising authority. "I would speak before this combat continues." Both warriors turned toward her in astonishment. Around the gathered crowd, murmurs of shock rippled outward. No woman had ever interrupted a formal combat, and the breach of custom was so severe that many seemed unsure how to react. "Runa," Stigvar warned, his voice tight with exhaustion and concern. "Wife, this is not your place," Olaf added, though his tone carried curiosity rather than anger. "It is exactly my place," she replied, stepping forward onto the sand. "This combat began because of words I spoke in council. If my tongue can start wars, perhaps it can also end them." She walked between the two warriors, acutely aware that she stood in the space where death had been circling for the past hour. Both men lowered their weapons slightly, more from bewilderment than any lessening of tension. "Lord Olaf," she addressed the younger Jarl directly, "your intervention just now proved something important. You value honor above easy victory. That suggests you might also value wisdom above unnecessary bloodshed." "Speak your meaning, woman," Olaf replied, though his breathing was still labored from combat. "The conspiracy among your men reveals a truth neither of you has acknowledged," Runa continued. "Your warriors fear what happens if you fail here today. They're desperate enough to risk dishonor to ensure success. That desperation speaks to genuine need, not mere greed." She could see understanding beginning to dawn in both men's faces, but pressed on before either could respond. "And you, my husband," she turned to Stigvar, "have been fighting as if defeat means only personal death. But if you fall, who protects Skarnvik from the truly desperate among Olaf's followers? Who ensures that honor survives when hungry men make decisions born of fear?" The question hung in the salt air like a challenge to both warriors' fundamental assumptions about the nature of their conflict. The beach fell into absolute silence as Runa's words echoed across the gathered crowd. Both Jarls stood frozen, their weapons lowered but not forgotten, while hundreds of eyes watched to see how this unprecedented breach of custom would unfold. The morning wind carried the salt scent of the sea, but it might as well have been the breath of the gods themselves. So charged was the atmosphere with possibility and danger. "You would have me break sacred combat?" Olaf asked finally, his voice carrying genuine confusion rather than anger. "End honorable contest with words alone?" "I would have you both remember why this combat began," Runa replied, her courage wavering but her conviction holding firm. "Not for personal glory or ancient grudges, but for the welfare of your people. Has that purpose been served by crossing swords?" Stigvar wiped sweat from his brow with his free hand, his breathing still labored from the prolonged fight. "The custom is clear, Runa. Combat begun must be combat ended." "Then finish it," she replied, surprising them both, "but finish it with understanding of what victory truly means." She turned to address the gathered crowd, her voice carrying farther than she had thought possible. "Look around you. Do you see enemies here, or do you see people facing the same struggles that have plagued the North since our ancestors first carved halls from the wilderness?" Among Stigvar's people, she could see heads beginning to nod. These were practical folk who understood the realities of survival in harsh lands. Among Olaf's warriors, the response was more mixed. Some faces showed interest, others suspicion, and a few darkened with outright hostility. "Lord Olaf," she continued, focusing on the younger Jarl, Your man Bjorn acted from fear, not fear of death, which any warrior accepts, but fear of returning to hungry children and empty stores. Is that not so?" Bjorn himself, still standing apart from his fellows in disgrace, raised his head at her words. "My lord, she speaks truth. My youngest son, he grows thin despite all we can provide. When I saw you might fall—" "Silence," Olaf commanded, but not unkindly. "I will hear no justification for dishonor, whatever its cause." "Nor should you," Runa agreed, "but you should hear the desperation that drove it. Just as my husband should hear the courage that moved you to preserve honor, even when treachery would have served your purpose." The complexity of the situation was becoming clear to everyone present. This was not a simple matter of strong versus weak, or right versus wrong, but of honorable people driven to extremes by circumstances beyond their control. Eric the shipmaster stepped forward from among Stigvar's followers, his weather-beaten face thoughtful. "My lords," he said formally, "might I speak to this question of need versus honor?" Both jarls nodded permission, and Eric continued. "I've sailed these waters for 30 years, trading with settlements from the ice fields to the southern kingdoms. Everywhere, I see the same truth. When people prosper together, they fight less. When they struggle separately, they fight more." Magnus, the silver-tongued, joined him, his merchant's mind clearly working through possibilities. The fishing grounds Lord Stigvar offered. They could feed Grimhold's people through the winter months. The trade partnerships could bring prosperity that makes future conflicts unnecessary. "Pretty words," called out one of Olaf's warriors, a heavy-set man with scars crossing his face. "But what guarantee do we have? What stops them from withdrawing these offers once we sail home?" It was Thorbjorn who answered, his white beard catching the morning light as he stepped forward. "The same thing that stops you from raiding our ships once the agreement is made, mutual benefit backed by mutual threat. Break faith with us, and we break faith with you. Honor maintained through balance." The discussion was taking on the character of a formal assembly, with representatives from both sides contributing to a debate that had moved far beyond the original combat. Yet through it all, Stigvar and Olaf remained in the center, weapons still in hand, waiting for resolution. "There is another consideration," Olaf said slowly, his eyes moving from Runa to Stigvar and back again. "Trust must be demonstrated, not merely spoken. If we are to build alliance from antagonism, it requires proof of good faith." "What manner of proof?" Stigvar asked. "Marriage bonds between our houses as originally proposed," Olaf replied, "but not mere political arrangements. Real connections that create genuine kinship." Runa felt her pulse quicken. In their culture, marriage alliances were indeed sacred, creating obligations that transcended immediate politics. But arranging such bonds required careful negotiation and willing participants from both families. "I have 2 daughters," Olaf continued, "and 3 nephews of marriageable age. You have young warriors and eligible kinswomen. Such bonds would make future betrayal not merely dishonorable, but literally kinslaying, the most cursed of crimes." The proposal was both practical and profound. In a world where family ties were sacred above all else, creating actual blood relationships between the settlements would provide security that no mere treaty could match. "There is wisdom in this," Stigvar acknowledged, "but such arrangements take time to negotiate properly. Meanwhile, your people still face winter hunger, and mine still fear your raiders." "Then we begin with immediate measures while planning longer solutions," Runa interjected, the pieces of a comprehensive plan forming in her mind. Shared hunting parties for the autumn season, joint fishing expeditions to the northern banks, combined trading ventures to spread the risks and double the profits. Young Gunnar, who had been silent throughout the discussion, suddenly spoke up from among Stigvar's warriors. "My lord, I would volunteer for such ventures. Better to test these Grimhold men as allies than to fight them as enemies." Several voices rose in agreement, both skeptical and supportive. but the overall trend was clear. The people were ready to try cooperation instead of conflict if their leaders could provide a framework for such effort. "And what of justice for the treachery attempted?" Olaf asked, his gaze falling on Bjorn Ironhand. "Honor demands consequence for dishonor, regardless of motivation." This was the crux of the matter. How to punish the attempt at deception without destroying the fragile possibility of alliance. Runa could see that everyone understood the importance of this decision. Too harsh, and it would breed resentment that might undermine future cooperation. Too lenient, and it would suggest that honor was negotiable. "Let him serve the betrayed," Stigvar said finally, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "1 year in my service, learning the value of the honor he nearly cast away. His family's needs will be met from my stores, but he will earn that provision through honest labor." The solution was elegant. Punishment that served justice while also addressing the underlying problem that had driven Bjorn to desperation. Even more importantly, it demonstrated trust and forgiveness that would resonate throughout both communities. Olaf nodded slowly. "It is fair. Bjorn, do you accept this judgment?" "I do, my lord," Bjorn replied, relief evident in his voice. "Gratefully." The formal elements of justice satisfied, attention returned to the larger question of the combat itself. Both Jarls still held weapons, and technically the contest remained unfinished. Yet everyone present understood that the situation had evolved beyond simple victory or defeat. "The combat must end," Stigvar declared finally, "but let it end in a manner that honors both tradition and wisdom." "How do you propose to achieve such an ending?" Olaf asked. Runa looked between the two warriors, then at the ancient patterns carved into her silver arm ring. In those intertwining designs, she saw the answer that had been there all along. "The combat ends as it began," Runa announced, her voice carrying newfound authority, "with honor preserved and purpose served." She stepped closer to both warriors, studying the intricate patterns on her arm ring, ravens in flight, their wings intertwined in eternal dance. "In our traditions, combat between equals can end in 3 ways: victory, defeat, or recognition of mutual worth. I propose the 3rd path." Stigvar and Olaf exchanged glances across the space between their sword points. Both men bore the marks of their contest, cuts, bruises, and the deep exhaustion of prolonged combat, but neither had been definitively defeated. "Mutual worth," Olaf repeated thoughtfully. "You speak of ancient customs, the old ways when Jarls could acknowledge each other as equals without loss of honor." "The very ways," Thorbjorn confirmed, stepping forward with the authority of his years. "I have seen such endings twice in my lifetime. Both times they prevented wars that would have devastated entire regions." Around the gathered crowd, murmurs of discussion rose as people recalled stories told by their grandparents. Tales of legendary warriors who had ended their contests not in death, but in alliance, their mutual respect forged stronger than any sword blade. "The ritual requires specific words," Stigvar said slowly, his memory reaching back to lessons learned in his youth. "And witnesses from both sides must acknowledge the legitimacy of the conclusion." Olaf nodded his understanding. 3 strikes exchanged in final salute, neither seeking advantage, both demonstrating skill worthy of respect. Then weapons lowered and hands clasped in brotherhood. "But first," Runa interjected, "both sides must publicly acknowledge what this combat has proven. Not the superiority of one over the other, but the courage and honor both possess." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were about to witness something rare and significant. Even the children stopped their fidgeting, instinctively understanding that they would someday tell their own grandchildren about this moment. Eric the shipmaster raised his voice to carry across the beach. "I witness for Stigvar the Red. He has shown courage in combat and wisdom in leadership. His strength serves his people's welfare above his personal glory." From among Olaf's warriors, an older man with iron-gray hair stepped forward. "I am Thorkel the Wise Speaker, and I witness for Olaf Ravensson. He has shown skill in battle and honor in preserving custom. His strength protects those who depend upon his leadership. The formal declarations created the framework for what would follow. Both leaders had been publicly acknowledged as worthy, establishing the foundation for mutual respect that would make alliance possible. "Are both parties willing to exchange the ritual strikes?" Thorbjorn asked with ceremonial gravity. "I am willing," Stigvar declared. "I am willing," Olaf confirmed. They moved apart to proper distance, raising their weapons in formal salute. The morning sun, now higher in the sky, caught the steel of their blades and transformed them into glittering silver fire. Around the beach, absolute silence fell as hundreds of people prepared to witness the conclusion of a contest that had begun as potential tragedy and evolved into possible triumph. The first exchange came with careful precision, both men striking with full technique but holding back the killing force that would have driven their blades home. Steel rang against steel in a clear, bright note that echoed across the water like a bell, marking the end of one age and the beginning of another. They separated, circled, and came together again. The second exchange showed even greater artistry, both warriors demonstrating the skills that had made them legendary. Their movements were poetry written in steel, a dance of deadly beauty that showcased decades of experience and natural talent. For the third and final exchange, both men seemed to reach beyond themselves, drawing upon reserves of strength and grace that transformed their tired bodies into perfect instruments of martial art. The final clash of their blades created a sound like thunder, a declaration to the gods themselves that honor had been preserved and wisdom had prevailed. Then, as tradition demanded, both weapons lowered simultaneously. Stigvar and Olaf approached each other with measured steps, their eyes locked in mutual assessment and growing respect. When they stood within arm's reach, both men extended their right hands. The clasp that followed was more than mere gesture. It was the physical embodiment of alliance, the moment when enemies became brothers through choice rather than blood. The crowd erupted in cheers that rolled across the harbor like storm waves, carrying relief, joy, and hope for a future none had dared imagine when the morning began. But even as celebration began around them, both leaders understood that the real work was just beginning. Alliance forged in ritual must be strengthened through action, and the complex negotiations ahead would test their wisdom as thoroughly as combat had tested their courage. Standing between them, Runa felt the weight of responsibility settle around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Her words had started this transformation, and her continued wisdom would be crucial in ensuring its success. With the ritual combat concluded and alliance declared, the real work began immediately. The beach that had served as battleground transformed into an open-air assembly, with representatives from both settlements gathering around driftwood logs arranged in a great circle. The morning's formal hostility gave way to practical discussion of how two independent communities might forge lasting cooperation. Stigvar and Olaf sat across from each other at the circle's center, their weapons now sheathed but their authority undimmed. Between them lay a collection of objects that would serve as foundation for their agreements: charts of fishing grounds, samples of trade goods, and most significantly, a parchment bearing the genealogies of both houses. "First necessity," Stigvar declared, his voice carrying across the gathered assembly, "is immediate relief for Grimhold's winter stores. Our granaries can spare grain for the lean months, but such aid requires guarantee of future reciprocity." Magnus, the silver-tongued, unrolled one of his trade charts, its surface marked with routes, seasons, and profit margins. The southern kingdoms pay premium prices for amber and furs during their festival seasons. Combined expeditions could gather such goods more efficiently than either settlement working alone. Olaf studied the chart with the attention of a man whose people's survival depended on understanding every detail. "My ships are faster, built for raiding and quick strikes. Yours are larger, designed for carrying heavy cargo. Together we could dominate the southern trade routes," Eric the shipmaster finished. Speed to reach the best markets first, capacity to bring enough goods to make the voyage profitable. The enthusiasm in the gathering was palpable, but Runa could see deeper currents beneath the surface optimism. Among Olaf's warriors, not all faces showed approval of this sudden shift from conquest to cooperation. Similarly, some of Stigvar's people seemed skeptical about trusting former enemies with their prosperity. Thira, Olaf's wife, spoke for the first time since arriving at Skarnvik. Fine words about trade and fishing rights. But what happens when the first disagreement arises, when young men from both settlements drink too much ale and remember old grudges? The question struck at the heart of practical alliance building. Treaties written on parchment meant nothing if they could not survive the inevitable friction of daily interaction between proud, armed peoples. Marriage bonds, Runa said, her voice cutting through the murmur of discussion. Not mere political arrangements, but genuine partnerships that create family connections across settlement lines. She stood and walked to the genealogy parchment, pointing to various names. Olaf's eldest daughter Astrid and Stigvar's nephew Bjorn, both unmarried, both of suitable age. The union would join bloodlines and create kinship obligations that transcend temporary disputes. And what says the maiden herself? Thira asked pointedly. Will she accept marriage to strangers for alliance's sake? From among Olaf's people, a young woman rose with graceful dignity. Astrid was perhaps 20 winters old, with her father's strong features softened by feminine beauty. Her blonde hair was intricately braided with silver threads, and her bearing spoke of both noble birth and personal courage. I have listened to this morning's proceedings, Astrid declared, her voice clear and confident. I have seen how enmity can transform into alliance through wisdom and honor. If my marriage can strengthen such transformation, I am willing to meet this Bjorn and judge his worthiness. Bjorn the younger, Stigvar's nephew, not the disgraced warrior, stepped forward in response. He was a handsome man of similar age, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of a working warrior. His brown hair and beard were neatly trimmed, and his eyes held intelligence along with strength. Lady Astrid, he said formally, I would be honored by such consideration. Perhaps we might speak privately to determine if personal affinity exists alongside political advantage. The exchange was perfectly proper by Norse custom, acknowledging both duty and personal preference in matters of marriage. Around the circle, approving nods suggested that this first marriage bond might indeed take root in genuine attraction rather than mere obligation. Other connections suggest themselves, Thorbjorn observed, studying the genealogy with experienced eyes. Younger sons and daughters on both sides, creating a web of kinship that would make future conflict literally unthinkable. As specific matches were discussed and evaluated, the alliance began to take concrete form. Each proposed marriage created new obligations and opportunities, weaving the two settlements together with bonds stronger than any written treaty. But it was Olaf himself who raised the most crucial question. All this assumes success in our joint ventures. What happens if the southern trade proves less profitable than hoped? What if harsh weather destroys the fishing seasons? What if circumstances force us to choose between our separate survival and shared prosperity? The question hung in the salt air like a challenge to everything they had built that morning. It demanded acknowledgement that alliance, however well-intentioned, might not survive the harsh realities of northern life. Runa looked at the faces around the circle, some hopeful, some skeptical, all understanding that they stood at a crossroads where the wrong choice could lead to disaster for both communities. 6 months later, Runa stood once again at the carved window of Stigvar's hall, but the view that greeted her eyes bore little resemblance to the tense harbor she had witnessed that fateful morning. Where once 3 threatening longships had anchored in hostile formation, now dozens of vessels moved in easy cooperation. Some flying Skarnvik's colors, others bearing Grimhold's raven banner, many showing the mixed crews that had become commonplace. The winter had tested every aspect of their alliance, exactly as Olaf had predicted. When early storms damaged the fishing nets, both settlements had shared the loss and the labor of repairs. When raiders from the far islands threatened the southern trade routes, combined fleets had driven them off with losses too severe for future attempts. Most tellingly, when disease struck Grimhold's cattle, Skarnvik's herds had provided breeding stock to rebuild what was lost. Each crisis had strengthened rather than weakened their bonds, proving that necessity shared was lighter than necessity borne alone. Behind her, the hall bustled with preparations for the evening's feast. Today marked the formal wedding of Astrid and Bjorn, whose courtship had blossomed from political necessity into genuine affection. 3 other marriage bonds had followed their example, creating a network of kinship that made the 2 settlements feel more like distant neighborhoods than separate communities. Lost in thought again? Stigvar's voice carried gentle amusement as he joined her at the window. "Remembering," she replied, leaning into his familiar warmth. "6 months ago, I knelt in that marketplace, believing I had nothing left to offer the world. And now I know that sometimes what appears to be nothing contains everything." She turned in his arms to face him fully. "Your people accept me not because of my birth or my dowry, but because of choices I made in moments when choices mattered." The transformation had not been easy. Many of Skarnvik's women had initially viewed her with suspicion, the foundling who had somehow captured their legendary leader's interest. But her role in forging the Grimhold alliance, combined with her genuine efforts to learn and contribute to household management, had gradually won acceptance and even friendship. More surprisingly, she had discovered abilities she had never known she possessed. Her father's teachings about reading people and situations, once merely survival skills, proved invaluable in mediating the small disputes and cultural differences that arose between the settlements. Stigvar had begun including her in councils, not from courtesy, but from recognition that her insights often revealed solutions that escaped more traditional thinking. "There's something you should know," Stigvar said, his tone becoming serious. "Olaf has proposed a formal confederation, not just alliance between Skarnvik and Grimhold, but expansion to include 3 other settlements that face similar pressures." The implications were staggering. Such a confederation would create the largest peaceful coalition in their region, potentially changing the entire balance of power among the northern peoples. "What did you tell him?" "That such decisions require counsel with my wisest advisor," Stigvar replied with a smile that took years off his weathered features. "Will you help me think through the possibilities?" Before she could answer, a commotion from the harbor drew their attention. A familiar ship was approaching, not from Grimhold, but from the south, flying colors neither of them recognized. As it drew closer, they could see its unusual design, sleeker than northern vessels, but carrying the dragon prow that marked it as built for these waters. "Traders from the southern kingdoms," Stigvar observed, studying the ship through narrowed eyes. "But flying no banner, I know." Within an hour, the mystery was solved. The ship carried emissaries from King Harald himself, drawn north by reports of the unprecedented cooperation between Skarnvik and Grimhold. The southern monarch, facing his own challenges with fractious jarls and rebellious territories, sought to understand how former enemies had transformed conflict into alliance. The emissaries brought more than curiosity. They carried offers of formal recognition, trading privileges, and protection under royal authority for any confederation that could maintain peace and prosperity in the northern regions. "The world is changing," Olaf observed that evening as the 3 leaders met in private council. "The old ways of raid and conquest grow less profitable as southern kingdoms organize better defenses. The future belongs to those who can build rather than merely destroy." Runa looked around the table at the 2 men who had nearly killed each other 6 months before, now planning joint ventures that would span the known world. In her hand, She turned the silver arm ring that had marked her transformation from desperate outcast to trusted advisor, its ravens seeming to whisper of flights to distant shores and opportunities beyond imagination. "The Confederation makes sense," she said finally. "But only if we can maintain what we've learned here, that true strength comes from choosing cooperation when conflict would be easier." Both Jarls nodded agreement, and in that moment, Runa understood that her journey from the marketplace mud to this council chamber represented more than personal salvation. She had become part of something larger, a transformation that might reshape how their people related to each other for generations to come. Outside, the evening feast was beginning, with voices raised in songs that celebrated not conquest but partnership, not individual glory but shared prosperity. Through the window, she could see couples dancing, some from Skarnvik, some from Grimhold, many now mixed families that embodied the living proof of their alliance. The torn cloak she had worn that desperate morning now hung in her wardrobe beside fine gowns that marked her status, but she treasured it more than all the rich fabrics. It reminded her that dignity could survive any circumstance, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from strength alone, but from the wisdom to recognize when strength should serve something greater than itself. As Stigvar took her hand and led her toward the celebration, Runa smiled at the thought that her father would have been proud. She had learned his lessons well, but more than that, she had learned to teach them to others.